This is Garden Variety, a horticulture podcast from Iowa Public Radio and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I'm Charity Nebbe. When you encounter an insect in a surprising place, it can be alarming, particularly if you are one of the many people who has an uncomfortable relationship with insects. Entomologist Schumm is an insect diagnostician at the Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic at Iowa State University. He is here to give us the tools we need to decide if an insect is a pest or something we should leave in peace. Zach, welcome.
Good morning.
So, Zach, when we're outside, obviously we're going to be surrounded by insects. I guess maybe you need to help us understand in context what you're talking about, because you do hear from a lot of people who see an insect and get kind of panicked. So what is the scenario?
So the overall scenario is that a very small proportion or number of insects are actually harmful or potentially harmful to humans and human systems. And there is well over 1 million species out there. There's still a lot of questions about exactly how many we estimate are in the world, so to speak. But a very, very small proportion are actually going to be impactful to people or gardens or pets or household structures. And I think if you have that uncomfortable relationship with insects, you tend to see things. And if you're unfamiliar with what that exact insect is or looks like, you tend to be a little bit more on the scared side or afraid side or concerned side than the I'm just going to ignore it and let it exist in my garden or maybe even in my house. And I try to encourage people to just understand just how few of them are actually impactful to people, and encouraging people to just do a little bit more discovery or learning to determine what to do if you find an insect that you're unfamiliar with.
And I mean, a lot of people really do have this uncomfortable feeling and have been socialized to be uncomfortable about insects. So you're not shaming people in any way in this scenario, because I know a lot of people really kind of struggle with this. But okay, so I'm in the garden and I see an insect and I don't know what it is. What should I do?
So again, just the first thing is just remembering that if you do see something you're unfamiliar with, you're less likely to have to be concerned than you are to be concerned. But the way that I kind of generalize this, and this is, I'll put an asterisk on this because I'm definitely generalizing, but if we're seeing something that is potentially impactful to your home garden, you tend to see more than one or two individuals. So if we're thinking of a very broad example of this, when you go outside into your garden and you see a praying mantis, something that a lot of people know are generally beneficial because they're predators and they're eating, quote, plant pests, we know that those are not generally pest insects, or with an asterisk for non-native species. But if you then on the other side of that, if you're seeing like a dozen or 2 dozen, or you're seeing a giant cluster of really small insects on one particular plant, that is more likely to be something that's plant feeding and more potentially going to be a plant pest. That being said, just because you're seeing something that is plant feeding doesn't mean it's at pest status in your garden, which is another important thing. There are a lot of individuals, and myself included, if I see a lot of insects on my plant, I might be concerned about them doing damage to the plant, but just because it's plant feeding doesn't mean that they're going to cause enough damage to harm your home garden or your landscape. So there's a lot of discovery that you have to do there. You have to know what the insect is exactly. You have to know if it is going to be able to reach some threshold to actually damage your garden. There's a lot of factors at play here. So just even if you see something that you know is plant feeding, you don't necessarily have to take action. It's good to identify what that insect is to the species level if you can, and then determine how impactful it could potentially be.
Okay, and so if I see an insect or 1 or 2 insects and I can't identify them, you're hoping that I will approach with curiosity.
Yes.
and maybe just not even ever answer the questions that I may have about them. Just let that go. But if I see a cluster of insects and I don't already know what they are, I will admit that my first impulse would be to turn to the internet. And
Sure.
That's not your favorite thing to do, is it?
It's not that it's not a useful thing to do, because there's a lot of very useful information on the internet. But one of the trends that I've seen popping up as of late is using mobile applications to identify insects.
And the ones for plants have gotten very good.
They're quite good. And like, I don't know how to identify plants, so like I can use a plant app and be generally confident in it. But one of the problems with insects is that many of the ones that we see in, that are small in the garden, they're so small that your phone camera can't pick up enough detail to be confident in the identification that those mobile apps are giving you. If you find a larger insect, let's say like it's the size of a quarter or larger, you can be a lot more confident in the app's general identification. But once they get small, they're a lot less useful and a lot less reliable. When I get an insect in the diagnostic clinic and I'm identifying it to generally like the family level, which would be like, oh, aphids are all in the same family, regardless of what species they are. I am doing things like looking at hairs. I'm counting the little tarsi, which are like the toes on the insects. Things that are microscopic that phone cameras just cannot pick up and may never. I mean, they probably will at some point. But so at that point, apps just become a lot less reliable. Things like iNaturalist, where people can put in comments to get accurate IDs, those are sometimes a little bit more useful, but it takes time to get those IDs back, right? So that's why diagnostic clinics like ours exist, so that we can help you with those identifications when you need help.
And what do you want from somebody who wants an identification? What are you hoping they provide you with?
So, and I'm going to kind of contradict myself here a little bit, but often we say to start with photographs. And that only just comes from experience of me looking at photographs and knowing what insects are on what plants. If you can get a good photograph, ideally it won't be blurry, but small insects are very challenging to get photos of. So try to get the best picture you can in focus as best as you can. I often tell folks to zoom in as far as you can without making the picture blurry. The second you get too close or you zoom in too much and it's a little bit blurry, it tends to be a little bit harder to provide identifications. It's better if you zoom out, even though the insect's really small in the picture, but it's in focus. We can always start there, and if I can't identify things from that, I recommend getting samples into us in the diagnostic clinic, and that's when I do the whole thing of putting it under a microscope and getting a confirmation on that individual's
But
species.
You don't want our first impulse to be to squish it and send it to you.
That is not the general hope, and certainly, like I think if we're thinking on the grand scheme of things, if you kill one insect in your garden, like that's not the end all be all. Like I'm a little bit biased because I save everything.
You're pro insect.
And
got you.
I actually find it kind of fun when insects are eating my plants because, especially when it's like, I mean, things like leafcutter bees, they're just like, they destroyed my whole garden a few years ago in Utah, and like I was thrilled about it. So I'm a little bit different, but first impulse should never be to just kill it. Odds are you can just leave it there until you get an identification from a professional.
Okay. All right. So let's say I do have a plant that is covered in insects and I figure out what the insects are. You're telling me still, I mean, obviously you wanted your garden to get destroyed. So
Yeah.
I don't. Let's start there. But, you're telling me that even if I have a plant that has a bunch of insects on it, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a true threat to that plant or to the garden. So how do I understand that?
That's something that's a lot harder to determine. And where the baseline of this is if you're talking about, if we switch gears and talk about like large agriculture, there's going to be a point where you can spend enough money or time on managing something that you're going to spend more money and time than just losing a little bit of the yield that you get from your garden that you're harvesting from, or losing a little bit of aesthetics. And the homeowner or the gardener or the farmer, like they get to make that decision on if they're willing to tolerate a little bit of damage or a little bit of loss to potentially save money on management. Any chemical that you go buy off the shelf or anything you do is going to cost money. So when we're talking to people about managing insects in the home garden, it's always making a determination about what's going to be the most cost effective, the most environmentally friendly, and also balancing out whatever they're trying to get out of their garden. Are they harvesting? Or are they just growing something like a nice, pretty aesthetic garden? It depends. So homeowners and home gardeners make those decisions themselves.
Right.
And
Everybody has a different tolerance level.
We want them to make those decisions. And the job isn't just to buy a chemical off the shelf and just spray it and hope that you take care of the problem. You have to identify what the actual problem is, determine if it could potentially be severe and damage whatever you are trying to accomplish in your garden, and then take according action, which often doesn't imply the use or need the use of chemicals. Usually we're suggesting other things like a jet spray of water or hand removal of insects, rather than spending money on an expensive chemical and maybe getting the control that you're trying to get.
Right. Or, of course, in a vegetable garden, you have additional concerns if you're
For sure.
choosing the chemical option. So, okay, a jet spray of water, that's one possibility, a very temporary solution
Sure.
for a lot of insects. Do you have some advice on some of the other mechanical controls that we could turn to in the garden that, again, maybe the aesthetics wouldn't be perfect, but we might be able to tolerate the pests in our garden a little bit better?
Sure. And there are a couple. And I will say that it can kind of depend on what insect you're dealing with in the first place, which is why identification is so important. That's always the first thing that you do. A lot of the tactics that I recommend are hand removal. So if you have a smaller number of insects, you can just hand remove them. And, I always say put them in a bag and stick them in the freezer. You can use things like row covers if you know that you have insects that are flying into your plants. We have to take into account other things like if pollination is necessary for those plants, which is why we have to generalize here. You can also use pruning as a strategy. If you have a large tree, for example, and we see this all the time, you have a large tree that has aphids that are really bad on a couple of branches. You can just prune those branches as long as it's otherwise safe for that tree or that plant. Things of that nature can really help to remove pests or potential pests from those plants. And I will say that, you brought up that the jet spray might be temporary, and that's true. But I often see that if people are doing that regularly and keeping up with it, they can limit the damage on their plants to the point where they're content with what's happening in the garden.
There are some pests that we also cannot control. I mean, of course, I'm thinking about Japanese beetles because they show up most summers and they show up in such large numbers that you really cannot do anything about them. So do you sometimes have to also understand when you're defeated?
Yeah. Well, and one of the first things that I tend to recommend is tolerance. I mean, so if someone's working with something very persistent in the home or the garden, doesn't really matter. We have to and maybe should learn to tolerate them a little bit because the goal of trying to remove every single insect or every single pest in this case from your garden is kind of impossible. If you're doing that, you probably don't have a healthy ecosystem in that little microclimate area, right? So it's always good to just have some tolerance and then take some other action if necessary.
Zach Schumm is an insect diagnostician with the Plant and Insect Diagnostic Clinic at Iowa State University. For more gardening information and tips, please subscribe to our Garden Variety newsletter. Find out more at iowapublicradio.org/garden. I'm Charity Nebbe. Garden Variety is a production of Iowa Public Radio and Iowa State University Extension. It's produced by me, Erin Stile, Caitlin Troutman, and the Iowa Public Radio talk show team. For more garden goodness, please subscribe to our Garden Variety newsletter. Just go to iowapublicradio.org/garden. I'm Charity Nebbe. See you next time.